This is Clark the Knife, and this is the Hinderer XM-18 Skinny Slicer. And this is probably the best Hinderer for most people, and it's definitely the best XM-18 for most people. Now I'm going to talk about why. I try to give the most helpful reviews on YouTube, give you everything you need to understand whether this is the right knife for you or not, who it's the right knife for, how I feel about it, particularly from a utility perspective. Reviews go through 3 phases: specs, then looking at the knife tip to tail, finishing with a sort of 10-point review, sort of systematic review, so you get a better sense of how I feel overall. Let's get right into it. I really, really like this knife. Let's start with some specifications. So, we all know the XM-18 pretty well. I think most people watching this probably have at least heard of the XM-18. Many of you have handled the XM-18, and the Skinny, marked by the S here, is exactly what you would think. It is an XM-18 3.5, but skinnier. Like all Hinderers, this knife is made in the United States of America at Hinderer's Ranch. I forgot to mark the price down on my sheet. The price of these guys is $425 retail. That's for a standard stonewash version like this. Most of the basic working finish versions are similar. You can get versions that start to get a little more expensive than that with some special finishes, stuff like that. But most are going to be $425. They don't charge for basic anodization, things like that. The length of the blade is 3.54 inches, which is a little bit more than that 3.5 inches. This blade, because it's a skinny, is 0.14 inches thick. So 140 thousandths, that's the same blade thickness as something like a paramilitary 2. Same blade thickness as a large Sebenza, approximately. Actually, I guess the same thickness as a large Inkosi, a little bit thicker than the large Sebenza. So, you know, it's skinny for Hinderer, but it's sort of what you see from a lot of other brands in terms of the stock thickness they tend to use for their harder use knives. The Spyderco Shaman is 140 thousand as well. The seal on this one I've got is MagnaCut, which is cool. Hinderer has started to use MagnaCut much more regularly in their knives. We're still seeing lots of S45 VN, which I personally do not have an issue with. I quite like S45 VN, especially when it's heat treated well, but it is always cool to see MagnaCut here. My reviews are pretty steel agnostic, unless the steel is a really distinguishing factor for the knife. So everything that I'm saying for this review is going to apply equally, whether it's a 20CV skinny slicer, a MagnaCut skinny slicer, or an S45 VN skinny slicer. This knife overall is 8.27 inches long, 4.8 ounces. This is a full titanium frame log without any internal milling. So, you know, it's not a lightweight knife. It's not meant to be a lightweight knife, but because it is a bit of a skinnier profile, it is a little lighter than your typical XM-18. And the pivot here on the skinny, just as on the full thickness, is the tri-way pivot system, which lets you run this on bearings or phosphor bronze washers or Teflon washers. It's a very cool innovation from Hinderer, and just lets you get exactly the feel you want in your knife. So now let's do some size comparisons. And obviously the most important size comparison, the one to start off with, is the XM-18. And as you can see here, the skinny version does not change the dimensions from any of these angles whatsoever. The blade length is exactly the same, the handle length is exactly the same, the overall shape profile, none of that is changed by going from a full thickness variant to a skinny variant. But as you might expect, when you turn these knives like this, you start to see the differences. First, blade stock. 165 thousandths for the full thickness, 140 thousandths for the skinny version. That makes it a little skinnier, as you would expect. It also quite significantly improves cutting performance, and we will get there. The other thing that's skinnier is the scales. It's probably easiest to see butt to butt like this, and you can see if we line them up, not just because, in fact, I'll show scale to scale here. It's a little hard to see, but if we line them up properly, you can see on the show side, the G10 is a little bit skinnier. On the lock side, the titanium is a little bit skinnier. So overall, the knife is actually, if we put them bottom to bottom there, quite a bit thinner. overall in the skinny version than in the full thickness version. That changes the way it feels in the hand. That changes the way it feels in the pocket quite dramatically. And again, that skinnier blade does affect cutting performance, and we're going to talk about all of that. I'm not going to assume that you've watched my XM-18 review, so I am going to repeat a lot of my thoughts on the XM-18 platform. I also think that the ergonomics are different enough in this skinny version that it's worth reiterating some of those points. Next comparison here, let's pull out an ED20S, since more and more people are handling this knife. And you can see the overall size and profile of the XM-18, a little bit smaller of a knife in both the blade length and the handle length than the ED20S. But when you turn the skinny version on its side, the blade stock is actually a little thicker. You can't quite tell because of the swedges they put on here. If you look right where it's at its full thickness at the thumb studs there, you can see that even the skinny XM-18 is thicker blade stock than the slim ED20S. But you can also see when you look at the handles on the skinny are significantly slimmer on the XM-18 skinny compared to the Demco ED20S. Compare this to a Paramilitary 2. Exact same blade stock thickness on these two knives and very similar profile overall. Very similar blade length, very similar handle length, very similar just overall size in the pocket, in the hand, things like that. Again, let's look at this thinness one more time, and you will see that, if anything, the XM-18 skinny is a little bit thinner than your Paramilitary 2. One knife that it is quite similar to in sort of pocket profile is your large Sebenza. Large Sebenza blade stock is a little bit thinner than the XM-18. Again, your Nkosi blade stock would be very close to, if not exactly the same. Now, your XM or your Sebenza is quite thin in the pocket for the size of knife it is, but the XM-18 skinny is just about as thin as your Sebenza. I'm sort of alluding to a lot of things I'm going to talk about in the review in these size comparisons, and then I guess just one more. Let's just pull out an Eclipse, and you can see compared to the Eclipse, same general size as the Eclipse. And if you happen to have a TRM Atom, there it is compared to the Atom, similar length, but obviously a much chunkier knife. And just to continue to finish our typical size comparisons, there's a Bug Out. And you can see, you know, the XM-18 is just a bigger knife in general than the Bug Out. So let's talk about this XM-18 skinny slicer. So I think we've gone through what skinny means. This is the XM-18 platform. It is unmodified in terms of its overall profile, its overall shape. You've still got the big jaw here. You've still got the big flipper tab that acts as a finger guard, all that sort of stuff. I'll talk about that in a little more detail. But skinnier blade, skinnier scales on both sides, makes it lighter, makes it thinner, makes it slice better. This version has your slicer blade grind. Now, the slicer blade grind is a very interesting grind from Hinderer, where it's sort of this rising, and you can see this has been quite a user for me. You have this rising flat grind here, where it's actually a pretty shallow grind down at the base. So this is pretty thick behind the edge back here. But as you go toward the tip, there's more and more space for that grind to drop. It's the overall profile of their spear point, but it's a different grind. And as you get particularly up here, this can get pretty decently thin behind the edge. It's still not, you're not going to mistake this for your TRM Atom or anything like that. It is by no means an actual slicer. But this blade grind, particularly in sort of this region here, is slicey by Hinderer standards, as terrible a standard as that is. Your overall blade shape here, it's Hinderer spear point shape, which is a pretty typical drop point. And as I say about most pretty typical drop points, with sort of a belly in the front third of the blade and then a flat toward the back 2/3, this is a very nice, versatile profile. This is a blade shape that does everything well and nothing exceptionally well. And so it ends up, especially for a knife that is sort of aimed to be a general EDC, aimed to be a knife that does a little bit of everything well and can be pushed into any role, it's a very suitable blade shape. This curve on the cutting edge is not going to be extraordinary for any task, whether that's cardboard or gardening or digging in dirt or doing chores around the house or twine or, whatever, pick your chores. It's going to do them all well without being extraordinarily good at anything. Blade finishing is very, very nice. You've got, if you can see it through the schmutz, you've got Hinderer's typical stone wash on here. With Hinderer's stone wash, you do see those stones quite a bit. You tend to sort of see those little stone marks when you look very closely. This one, the stone wash is a little more even. Their etching is very, very nice on both the Horsehead and USA Magna Cut right there. They always add nice little flourishes to their blade shapes. Nice little swedge here. Very nice transitions knocked down by the stone wash. Always very just pleasant to look at. Plunge grinds here. It's a nice refined version of the spear point blade shape with a slightly more interesting and more utilitarian grind. You've got a full finger choil here, and it does absolutely work as a finger choil. I've got large size gloves, meaning my glove size is large, which really means I've got medium sized hands, and my finger fits very nicely in that front choil. It's deep enough that I don't really feel a risk of riding up onto that edge. If you had larger fingers, you might, but for me, it's quite functional. You have these excellent thumb studs right here, which do act as blade stops as well. So you can see if you look at the top here, basically these thumb studs are resting on the scale right there. The purpose of that is it protects the knife against sort of torquing. If there's forces that are trying to push this blade up or pull this blade down, the force is going to be distributed to these blade stops rather than the pivot. Makes it significantly tougher to a type of force that a lot of knives tend to be weak to. A lot of times, one of the areas that pivots can be thrown off balance is when you put those torquing forces, because all of that is often going to go straight to the pivot. This redistributes those forces to these thumb studs. It's a really good design. I love any time that I see that on a knife. And they also work really well as thumb studs. You've got a nice little sort of concentric dome setup here. Very nicely oriented relative to the pivot, where your natural sort of force is directly perpendicular to that line between the pivot and the thumb stud. So it's a stiff detent. It's a typical Hinderer detent, but once you overcome that detent, it fires out. And once you get used to it, it's just a really excellent thumb stud pop. Next, let's go to your other deployment method, which is your flipper. Typical Hinderer flipper tab, quite hooked, a little jimping on the back. Some people find this flipper tab pokey. I find that it's just really, really easy to catch your finger. Again, fairly stiff detent, and once you overcome it, the knife will fire out. I quite like it, and you can see that flipper tab also acts as a front finger guard for this front sort of finger indexing notch right there once it is deployed. You've got some nice functional jimping on the back here. Hinderer likes these very big jimps, and I also really like this jimping. So when your thumb is pressing down, it's where I really like jimping to be, which is when you press into it, the edges of this jimping will absolutely bite into your thumb and give you grip, give you traction. Especially you've got some jimping here on the lock side. And when you press down with your thumb and press down with this finger, so your finger goes into this jimping, that jimping is biting back, and it is preventing your thumb or your pointer finger here from moving anywhere on this knife. It's very nice. At the same time, when you're not pressing, it's rounded off enough. Basically, all of the tops of these jimps have been knocked down by the stone wash that it's not abrasive, it's not grabbing. This is really well done jimping. There's a lot of it. There's jimping down here, jimping here, jimping here, jimping back here. But I find that it is inoffensive because it is there when you need it, and it just looks cool, and it's not abrasive or doesn't catch anything when you don't need it. This is really, really well done jimping. I wish kind of more companies would do jimping sort of like Hinderer does, as opposed to some of the sharper, sort of toothier jimping you see on some other knives. Action is exquisite. So this is on bearings. It is well broken in. That is a beautiful, beautiful drop shot action. I mean, a well broken in Hinderer XM-18 literally reminds me of the actions that I got in some of my Shirogorov from a couple of years ago. I had an F95T for a little while. I had a F3 for a little while. And it's a smidge below that level. But the fact is, the smoothness of this bearing action, once an XM-18 breaks in, is as good as any bearing action you're going to find in the production space without going to a significantly higher price point. It's not quite at that same, like, incredible, exquisite level as what you get from, from your Triaxis, from your Grimsmo, from your Koenig, Holt, all those sort of action-first companies. There is a level of action above what you get for Hinderer bearings. But this is really, really good action. I don't think that there is a bearing action at the $400 to $500 price point that is significantly better than what Hinderer is doing with the XM-18 and with a lot of their other bearing knives in 2024. They're consistent. They drop shot without play. They have a stiff detent, but once you get used to that detent with this really nice flipper tab, with this really nice thumb stud, it fires out easily. It just takes a little more effort. The detents are fantastic, and then you add the tri-way system. And you add the fact that if you don't want that fast bearing detent, you can switch it over to phosphor bronze washers, get a more controlled action, or switch it over to Teflon and get that kind of glidey sort of action, sort of like, what old XM-18s were, or what current Emersons are, things like that. You have that option. That's not an option that pretty much any other company gives you. And it's really, really cool. It's also, frankly, and I say this in every Hinderer review, the fact that the tri-way system works and the fact that you get exquisite actions with, by the way, darn near perfect centering. It's a little off to the lock side right now. But, I mean, I've been using this quite a bit and I have made zero effort to recenter it or keep it centered. But the fact that these are knives that work, that have actions as good as they do, and they can accept all those different pivot options, it really is a testament to how well these knives are put together and how strong the fit and finish of Hinderer is in 2024. And the handle design of the XM-18 sort of needs no introduction by this point. So I already went through the jimping here. Basically, the secret sauce of this handle, why it is so good, why it is so ergonomically exceptional, in the sense that when you are gripping it in this grip or in this choked up grip here, there are very few knives that feel more secure in the hand than the XM-18. Like, it will not move. You feel like you have immense control over this blade. You feel like you can stab it as hard as you want. It's not going to move. You can drag it through anything, pull it through anything. If you need to chop, if you need to really get into something, this knife does not feel like it's going to budge, but it does it without any huge scallops. There are some big scallops here. There is some really nice jimping, but the secret sauce is really this curve across the back where it bows down into your hand. So when you're gripping it like this, your front finger is right behind that front choil, or right behind that finger guard there, into that front index. Your other fingers wrap around this big belly here. These big flats give your palm lots of solid purchase and prevent the knife from rolling in the hand. And then the fact that this whole thing sort of wraps a little bit around your pinky, the way it curves down, it gives basically an anchor point right at your pinky, anchor points at your front finger, anchor point at your thumb, whether you're choked up or whether you're choked back. And that there's always enough really solid contact with your hand that this thing just does not want to move in your hand. And it's not comfortable, pillowy like a lot of contoured knives are. There is no contouring on these G10 scales. It's a flat scale with this Hinderer pattern on it, a chamfer, a really nice even chamfer all the way around, right into the flat, titanium liner here, and then there's a slightly larger chamfer on your other side. this never is going to feel as pillowy like a fully contoured knife. Like, you're never going to mistake this for, how easy and effortless something like a TRM Atom feels in the hand. It's never going to feel that comfortable. But it also doesn't feel uncomfortable. And the harder you use this knife, the more secure it feels in the hand. And especially for a knife that I want the ability to push hard, for me, security in the hand is far more important than comfort in the hand. Because if a knife is secure in my hand, if it feels like I have control over the blade, if it feels like the knife is not going to move in my hand, then I can just focus on doing the tasks that I want to complete. And I don't have to worry about holding the knife, controlling the knife. You combine that with this very natural blade shape, how naturally that blade sort of points a little bit up and out of the handle, again, because the handle's oriented down towards your pinky. This is easy enough to get up on there, use the tip or use the belly for drag cuts. High enough tip, almost even with the back of the blade, that's easy to get around and into stuff to start those cuts. And you're starting with some of the slicier parts of the blade up front there. It does have a nice enough tip to stab and pierce. And for your longer cuts, like, your cardboard, things like that, where you're pushing through on an extended cut, there's enough belly here, enough of a long edge that it is very easy to keep this in that cut. One of the other cool things about the XM-18 platform is it works really nicely even with a lighter grip too. You can just pinch this knife here, really solid purchase point there, really solid purchase point there, and I've got tons of control over this knife with just these two fingers resting against my palm. And I feel like I can manipulate this knife pretty well. I mean, I'm not going to do any hard cutting like this, but then I can transition to this really easily. It's just, and then this choked up grip where you get close to the blade, you have so much control over that blade, so much control over that edge. If you want to pull, if you really want to get into it, really just dig that edge into something. It's a classic for a reason. There are very few knives that are ergonomically better than the XM-18 handle. And I think I actually like the ergonomics on this skinny version even a little more than I like the ergonomics on the full thickness version. The full thickness version, there's a lot of knife here, and it does kind of feel like a brick in the hand a little bit. Now, sometimes that's good. It's a little more handle heavy, but these flats are quite thick on the full thickness XM-18. This is a thick knife. That's awesome when you're doing hard tasks, when I'm trying to drag this through carpet, or hammer through something, or really pull through triple walled cardboard. Having all of this space to purchase on with your fingers and your thumb, really, really nice, really confidence inspiring. But if I'm trying to do a lighter task, just opening an Amazon box, or just cutting through some twine, or even pulling a zip tie or something like that, this big thick knife can feel kind of clunky in the hand. It can feel like overkill. It can feel just a little bit more awkward, and it is very handle heavy. So for those lighter tasks where you want to have a little more control over the blade, it does feel a little awkward, and you don't feel like you have quite as much control. With the skinny version here, you got less space to purchase, but you've still got more than enough. There has never been a task that I've been pushing this through, that I have been, even hammering on this or trying to basically saw with it, anything like that, where I've wished it was thicker. It has always been thick enough. But because it is skinnier, because it is a little more blade heavy, just as a function of this handle being lighter, the balance just feels a little bit more forward. I feel like I have a little bit more control over this blade, especially with lighter tasks. It also helps that it is just a lighter knife. That does help you also have a little bit more control over the blade. And so the XM-18 ergonomics are exceptional in whatever package you get. Maybe not the fatty. I haven't tried one of those. I don't think I'm going to like the fatty. But if anything, I think skinnying up these scales, regardless of the cutting performance, and we'll talk about that in the full scoring, but skinnying up the handle, I think actually makes the ergonomics of this significantly more versatile. I find that this goes from a knife that is meant for hard use, and technically you can use it for light duty stuff, but it really feels like it doesn't want to do light duty stuff. into something that is a true EDC in this skinnier package. There is no task that I have used this for that it feels overkill for or feels unsuitable for or anything like that. So skinnying up the handle really makes this feel more versatile. One last thing I'll mention, this is sort of my little war on Hinderer. I strongly prefer my Hinderers to be carried tip down with the clip position right here. This used to be the way that they all shipped from the factory, I believe. Now they typically ship from the factory tip up because most of the knife community prefers their knives tip up. The clip affects the ergonomics quite significantly on Hinderer knives. If you look at this, that clip sticks out quite a bit. Not in a way that is hot spotty or anything like that. I love the design of this clip. I find that it is one of the easiest clips on the market to get in and out of the pocket. It just does what a clip should do very well. But in this, I keep forgetting, like tip down position, if I go in this grip here, you can see my front finger goes right over those screws, and then this hump here ends up being where my middle finger and sort of my third finger land. And my palm ends up resting on this clip, and it feels even more secure in the hand in this choked up position when my hand is resting on this clip. It gives a little more sort of to grab onto right where I would want it, right on my knuckles. It helps the ergonomics significantly and makes this knife feel even more hand-filling than it is. I really like it. In this choked back grip, same thing, except now it's my front finger is on this ramp and my second finger is right at the bottom here. Again, makes the knife feel more hand-filling than it is without being pokey or anything like that. I strongly recommend, even if you are typically a tip up person, really do try carrying your Hinderer tip down, because I think especially for the Eclipse, it makes a major difference on the Eclipse ergonomically to me, but also on the XM-18, the ergonomics are just better when that clip is mounted tip down. And anytime I switch it to tip up, or I get scales that only allow me to mount it tip up or something like that, like, the knife just feels a little bit wrong to me. It's still very ergonomically good, but it's even better and it's at its best when the clip is mounted like that. I guess last thing, because I didn't talk about the clip side all that much, you've got that same really nice stonewash finish all the way through here, a slightly fatter chamfer on the clip side, or on the lock side, than you have on the show side. Again, you can move that clip to either position there. You got your Hinderer lock bar stabilizer under there. You do have a very nice secure frame lock with a lock bar insert, and there's your pivot. Hinderer right there, just very nice. And then I do love this little striping that they do in the lock bar relief there. It's just lots of unnecessarily cool little details the closer you look at this knife. And by the way, for OCD people, the fact that this chamfer is a little bit bigger on the lock side than it is on the show side here on the G10, that gets fixed if you get a titanium show side scale. And I've got a titanium show scale, full titanium review coming up. But if you have this with a G10 scale, the chamfer on the show side is a little bit smaller than the lock side. If you have a titanium scale, the chamfers will be exactly the same depth. Just a little detail. So let's get to the scores. And I think what will be clear is that this is both a really good and a really generally recommendable knife to me. I score on a 10-point scoring system. 5 scores are related to sort of the fun factor of the knife, knife enthusiast stuff, action, fit and finish, looks, things like that. And 5 are related to the functionality. Let's start with the blade design. Blade design I'm going to call a B minus or B plus. B plus. Again, there's nothing exceptional about the blade shape here, the overall profile. If you took it and sort of shadow box or put a shadow on it, it's a pretty typical drop point. It's Hinderer's spear point shape, but every blade shape the Hinderer does, they put their little touch on it, and it's really nicely executed. Really nice stone wash, really nice plunge. This rising slicer grind, you've seen more knives start to adopt this grind, but it was kind of a cool, relatively newer thing when they came out with it, at least in large-scale production knives. And it does what it's supposed to. It does make this part of the blade slicey while keeping this part of the blade a little bit more robust. This little swedge definitely adds some visual interest. The jimping is fantastic. The etching is fantastic. Just every part of this basic drop point shape is done really, really well. And then a basic drop point shape is super versatile. So that is very much a B+ blade design. It is about as attractive as a basic drop point blade can look, and quite functional. So solid B+ there. Handle design is an A, bordering on an A+. And when I get over to the feel here, I mean, the Hinderer XM-18, especially in this skinny, is a bordering on an A+. I think I have gushed enough by this point on how extraordinarily well thought out and extraordinarily just sort of useful and secure in the hand. I think this XM-18 handle is, whatever position you grip it in, it just feels right. It just feels ready to use. It is always secure in the hand. It is always ready for whatever you throw at it. And I happen to think it is also attractive. It also looks good in the way that Hinderers do, which is like, it's got that tough feel to it. The visible jimping everywhere. The kind of cockeyed look of the whole thing. The way they even do the lanyard hole, where it's just sort of put very smartly just between these two spacers here. There's nothing extraneous hanging off the back. It's just, and by the way, folded up, it still looks, it's still a nice looking knife folded up. The blade seats nicely into that handle. It's a signature handle design. It is one of the most distinctive on the market. The only things that are close to the XM-18 are things that are ripoffs of the XM-18. It is a solid A, bordering on an A+ for handle design by this point. The action is a solid A. I talked about this before. This is a beautiful drop shut action on bearings. Boop, just like that. Nice stiff detent, whether you're using the thumb stud or you're using that flipper tab. Very satisfying to actuate. And then you add the fact that you've got the tri-way system on top of that. This is as good as any bearing action you're going to get at this price point. And then you've got a phosphor bronze washer action and a Teflon washer action built in. Solid A for action. It's not at the level that you're going to get for, your high-end production knives or your customs, but it's as good as anything you're going to find at this $400 to $500 price point. Fit and finish is an A. Blade finish is a very nice stone wash. All of the chamfers, everything like that, really nicely done. Everything's knocked down really nicely. Etching is great. This handle finishing, the handle texture is just really nice. It's both functional and aesthetically nice. It's also very distinctively Hinderer. The chamfers everywhere are super nicely done, super consistent. Your scales just meet perfectly with your liners. And by the way, I love the fact that you can just buy, a bunch of hardware from Hinderer, and it's all going to fit perfectly because your fit and finish is so good. Your tolerances are so tight that anytime you buy new hardware, it's just going to fit. The way that this blade fits into the handle, there's very little space between these two handle scales and the blade. It is as thin as it could be without thinning out. Like, basically, there's no extraneous space. They would have to make either the scales thinner or the blade even thinner still to make this skinnier. Centering is very, very good. Your hardware, it just fits very nicely. Everything is very tight. I've never had any lock stick or anything like that. I've never had any play. This is really running at a level of fit and finish, both in terms of the complexity of what they're trying to do and the level at which they execute it, is really, really good for the $400 to $500 range. It is not quite at the immaculate level of Chris Reeve, but to get anything else that is markedly better than what Hinderer is putting out, you have to go to something much more expensive. Absolutely an A for fit and finish here. And the fact that you do have that whole make it your own thing really does both show how strong the fit and finish is and give you more options to, play around with it. And then cool factor, you know what, no, I'm going to make it an A-. I'm going to keep it as an A-. The XM-18 is a very cool knife. It's a signature knife. It's a distinctive knife. It's got that hard use heritage. I will admit, the skinny version is a little bit less cool. than the full thickness version for completely stupid reasons. I mean, Hinderer's heritage is based on like first responder stuff and like hard use. Like I'm gonna put my knife through a car door. Like Hinderer's reputation was built when that sort of stuff was cool. When you take that knife and you make it skinnier, you do lose little bit of that stupid testosterone-ious like heavy dutiness. This full thickness XM-18 is a little bit cooler than the skinny one. The other fact is there are many more aftermarket parts for this full thickness version than the skinny one. A lot of things, like your back spacers, or your standoffs, like your front scales, like some parts of your hardware, things like that. They're not necessarily compatible between the full thickness XM-18 and the XM-18 skinny, because as you would expect, screws need to be shorter, standoffs need to be closer together, stuff like that. But it's still a very cool knife because it is still an XM-18, and honestly, I think with modern blade steels, I don't actually think you're giving up any toughness whatsoever when you go to a skinny XM-18 compared to the full thickness. If you're looking at, MagnaCut and how tough MagnaCut is, or S45VN and how tough S45VN is, I don't think that a titanium knife with any of these blade seals needs to be any thicker than this skinny is to do whatever you could possibly use a 3.5 inch folding knife for. I can't imagine, to put it another way, I can't imagine any scenarios where an XM-18 3.5 inch skinny would break or would fail on you, but a full thickness would hold up. And you get so much more cutting performance, so much better carry for the skinny version. I've said many times before, I think that this should be the standard thickness of the XM-18. I think that the skinny version should be like, 120 thousandths on the blade stock, like your AD20S. And this 165 version, which is the Hinderer standard, should be the fatty version. That's the way that I would like to see it, but that's not what's happening. So this is the skinny version. Big digression to say the cool factor is an A- only because it's a little bit less cool than the standard thickness. So that gives you a solid A in fun factor, and that's just because it's an XM-18. It's still an XM-18 in the skinny version, and XM-18s are just cool and useful, and the action is sublime. Function here. Okay, cutting performance. Let's talk about the cutting performance of this skinny version. When you take that blade stock from 165 thousandths to 140 thousandths, you still have a not that tall blade, so there's not a ton of space to drop. And this is still a flat grind, and honestly, it's a kind of shallow flat grind. If you look at how deep this plunge gets, it's not the most aggressive flat grind, but this will become a solid cutter, especially once you lay the edge back. The factory edge on this is still kind of fat. And when I first got this skinny slicer, it cut significantly better than my XM-18 3.5, but so do some sharpened pencils. It cut okay. It would go through cardboard with some effort, things like that. Then I sharpened it 17 degrees per side on my TS Prof Cadet, and now this thing cuts very well. It has better cutting performance than something like my Paramilitary 2, which has the same blade stock thickness. It has equal to similar cutting performance, maybe slightly worse cutting performance than my AD20S. It's not a slicer, despite the name. It is still not a slicer by the standards of normal knives. You're not going to mistake this for, some Spyderco slicer knives. You're not going to mistake this for a TRM. It's not even a slicer as a Chris Reeve with a good edge on it. But this skinny version, when you thin out that blade stock, it makes a very, very big difference in cutting performance and immensely improves cutting performance over the standard thickness, especially once you lay that edge back. So it's a B+. The cutting performance is no longer a detriment of the XM-18 in this skinny version. It's still not a positive. It's still not an unusually slicey blade, but now it is solid. And the benefit of how exceptional the ergonomics are is even if you have to push a little bit harder to cut stuff, because it's not the sliciest knife in the world, you will gladly do that because the ergonomics make it very comfortable to do so. Utility, solid A. This is, especially in this skinny version, this is a knife that can do just about everything you would want a 3.5-inch knife to do. In this skinny, lighter version, you can use this for lighter cuts. You can use it to break down boxes. You can use it around the house. You can use it to, cut twine, open packages, things like that. And you can still use it like an XM-18. You can still use it to cut through seat belts. You can still use it to, saw through, 10 things of sisal rope, like whatever, cut through leather, all that sort of stuff. Like I've done a lot, as you can see, I've used this blade quite a bit. And there is nothing that I have ever used this on that it has felt like this was too thin of a knife, too skinny of a knife. Even if you compare this to your PM2, like the PM2, hard use knife, but everybody knows with the PM2, that tip gets pretty needly, and there are some things where you start using that tip and you're like, this feels a little squirrely. Never the case with this skinny XM-18. Even the tip stays pretty robust. This is still an XM-18. It's still a tough knife. But by making it skinny, they make it so much more useful for general utility. And it's just a way better everyday carry knife as a result. That's an A. Feel, this is an A. This is very, very close to an A+. I think I've gushed enough about the ergonomics of the XM-18 handle by this point, and I think I've gushed enough about how those ergonomics are, if anything, even better in this skinny version. It is one of the most ergonomically exceptional handle designs in the market. It works well choked up. It works well with all 4 fingers back on the knife. It works well gripping the knife, pinching it. Like this grip is great. This grip is great. This grip is great. It is super, super, super secure in the hand. In fact, I've got half a mind. I kind of think I have to make this an A+, honestly, because I'm really thinking about, if this isn't an A+, I actually don't know what would be. I can't think of many knives. Maybe there are a couple Emersons, but I'm okay having a handful of knives that get an A+. This is ergonomically as good as it gets for me. Carry, A-. The skinny, and you saw it in all the size comparisons. The fact that they skinnied the blade and skinnied the handles, this becomes a really thin object in the pocket. It's not light. It's still, 4.8 ounces, I think I had it at. But when you've got a knife that is that thin, that gives you all of that hard use performance that an XM-18 gives you, and is that thin in the pocket, this is legitimately a thin knife. When you're talking about something that is as thin as a Sebenza, and that is thinner than all your other standard hard use knives out there, you are getting a lot of performance for not a lot of space in the pocket. And when this knife folds up, most of that blade nestles nicely into this handle. It's not that large of an object. If you compare it to the PM2, it is about the size of a PM2 in the pocket. And again, if anything, it's about the same thickness. If anything, it might be a tiny, tiny bit thinner. But you are getting a knife that is markedly more robust than the PM2. So A- in carry. It's not like that. It's not like it is a Spyderco it's not like it's a Dragonfly or something like that. It's not like this disappears in the pocket. It's still way bigger in your pocket than something like an Atom. But you're also getting a lot more knife. And for the amount of knife that you are getting, the carry profile is really, really good. And then value here is a B+, very, very close to an A-. The fact is $425 for the level. $425 is a lot of money for a knife. Let's get that out of the way. But the level of fit and finish that you get from Hinderer in 2024, the benefits of the tri-way system, their beautiful blade finishing, their immaculate fit and finish throughout, the fact that you can, if you want to spend even more money, customize all the hardware, things like that, and you get that exceptional and signature XM-18 design. $425 is still a lot of money for a knife, but there is no part of this knife that feels expensive. There's no part of it that feels like a screaming deal, but there is no part of it that feels overpriced. And as I mentioned in some of my other Hinderer reviews, Hinderers feel like an even better deal now than they did in the past, because while other makers have crept up and up and up in their prices, Hinderers' prices have stayed pretty much the same. And so Hinderers feel like an even better buy than they used to. And so that's a solid B+, borderline A-. And so that's an A- in function. I might have even pushed it up to an A when I made that feel an A+. And the fact is, whatever that ends up being, this is a solid A of a knife. And to summarize, I actually think if you are playing in that, if you are somebody who wants a $400 to $500 knife, and you're saying, okay, I want a general EDC knife. I want something that is just going to, do what a knife needs to do, but I also want something that I can push harder. I want something that is very nice. I want something that is American made. And I want something that I can beat up, but will still, cut and will do a little bit of everything. The fact is, and let me get the option 3, there are only really 3 options you need to care about, if you ask me. And the skinny XM-18 absolutely belongs in this discussion for the best knives in this premium price range for everyday carry, everyday use. I will get to my cursory reviews at some point. I still think that the Sebenza is probably the best knife on the market. The Inkosi is not that far behind, but when you take the XM-18, you skinny it up, you fix that cutting performance, you let those exceptional ergonomics shine, you make it easier to carry, you make it slice better, you keep that exceptional action, and you make it so you balance the knife a little bit better by lightening out that handle, and you keep everything that's great about Hinderer. This is just a phenomenal and hugely recommendable EDC knife. I'll say it one more time. I think that this skinny XM-18 should be the default XM-18. I think that this shouldn't have an S here. Your standard XM-18 should be exactly what we're seeing on the table here, with exactly this handle scale thickness, exactly this blade thickness. This is better than the full-size XM-18 in every single way, except for that stupid reptilian brain, like, oh, thick means tough, which is outdated because with modern steels, it's not even a difference that actually matters. But in every single functional way, this skinny version is not just a small improvement, is a marked improvement over the full thickness XM-18. It keeps everything that is good about the full thickness and resolves some of its largest problems, while even building further on some of its strengths. The ergonomics are even better on the skinny version than on the full thickness version. The action feels even better on the skinny version than on the full thickness version, because having a little bit of a lighter blade, having a little bit lighter handles does help with the feel of that action. It's just an extraordinarily good, extraordinarily well-made knife. And if you want a USA-made, high-quality, premium knife that can do everything, there are very few choices on the market that are better than the XM-18 skinny. And frankly, I don't think you even need the slicer blade. You can get the skinny, you can get it in the Skinner blade, you can get it in the slicer blade, you can get it in the sheep's foot blade. You can get it in a harpoon spanto, which that wouldn't be my favorite because the spanto grind still sucks, but any grind you get this in, pretty much everything I said is going to remain true. Again, maybe with the exception of the harpoon spanto, because that grind sucks. It looks cool, but it functionally sucks. But you don't even need a slicer. If you have a chance to get an XM-18 3.5-inch skinny, do it. Especially on the secondary market. On the secondary market, you can get these knives for $350. There is not a knife on the market at $350 that will outperform this one. And frankly, after really using this knife and using it regularly for the purposes, not just for the purposes of this review, but this has become my sort of standard everyday carry knife. This has been, you know, I've said before, anytime I'm reviewing a knife, I like to carry 2 knives, at least 2. Usually I'll carry 3, and most of the time, one of the 3 I carry will be a knife that I really like. One, because if the other knives I have suck, I want to still be able to get tasks done. And 2, I always like to compare in real time whatever knife I'm reviewing to a knife that I know is good. This has become my standard good knife. And anytime I'm not in reviewer mode and I am just, you know, carrying a knife to do knife stuff, this has pretty much become my pick 100% of the time. And honestly, if you told me I had to take my knife collection down to 1 knife and I could only have 1 knife for the rest of my life, and let's say that, you know, let's ignore the fact that I'm in California and I have 3-inch knife laws and stuff like that. Let's just say, performance-wise, you can have 1 knife for the rest of your life. What would that be? I mean, it is really down to a 2-horse race for me. And honestly, that's not bad company to be in. And the Hinderer's getting pretty close to taking the top spot for that. It is really... The more I use it, the more I'm like, the Sebenza is awesome, but this thing does everything so well. It's just, the skinny XM-18 is a really, really, really good knife. It is functionally exceptional. It is beautifully made. It is priced right for what it is. And I think anybody who plays in this price range, especially if you care about it being made in the USA, and especially if you appreciate this higher level of quality, higher level of production. And the one caveat is, and if you know how to sharpen so that you can lay back a not so great factory edge, I think that this is as recommendable as any knife on the market right now to people that are playing in this space. Complete, unhesitating, you know, unqualified recommendation. And I think that for most people, this is the best knife the Hinderer makes. And I think most people will enjoy this knife more than anything else the Hinderer makes. And I mean, if they made a hollow ground skinny version, a hollow ground skinny slicer, that would be awesome. That would be really, really cool. I can dream. Anyway, I hope you found this helpful. Bit of a gushing review, rambling as usual, but I hope you still found some value in here, or at least got some entertainment out of it. Let me know your thoughts on the XM-18, the full thickness or the skinny. Let me know, you know, how you feel with the knives. You might like it more than me. You might like it. You probably won't like it more than me, but you might like it less than me. I would love to know why. Let me know any other knives you'd like me to review. And other than that, hope you enjoyed your time here. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye now.